What's up, y'all? It's your boy R to the A to the S. Yes, Roz, here with Pursuit Carson Blog. And today I'm here with a special guest. I'm at the Legacy Conference with somebody who has influenced me a lot through his writings, heard him speak many times at in the Orthodox Christian Fellowship where I was on staff at. Here with the one and only Dr. Carl Ellis Jr. Dr. Ellis, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
All right, I want to ask you some questions about the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. There are various viewpoints on his his life, his theology. I want to get your thoughts on whether he was Orthodox or not. A lot of Christians celebrate him, but some people question whether he was Orthodox. You look at his ethics. Some people say that was on point, but his theology is questionable. So I want to get your thoughts as Christians. How should we view the legacy of Dr. King?
Well, I was one of those who, I marched with Dr. King when I was much younger. I was very active in the civil rights movement, and then I got saved.
Okay.
And somehow I got the impression that now that I'm saved, it was not right for me to be involved in the civil rights movement. It took a while for God to kind of get that mess out of me. But as I gained knowledge of Scripture and knew more about biblical teaching, I began to question Dr. King and think that he wasn't Orthodox, that he wasn't the real thing.
Okay.
And because my basic criticism was, I said that he could not be authentic because he wasn't an evangelical.
Okay.
Because I believe the hype that the presence of God is wherever there's evangelicalism, that's the presence of God. Okay. And then I discovered, to my chagrin, that Dr. King applied to a couple of tried to apply to a couple of well-known evangelical seminaries, and they would not even accept his application at all because they didn't accept blacks. And as a matter of fact, one of those seminaries I tried to apply to, they said, don't bother. Now, I'm not that old.
Okay.
But, and I thought, well, and then he ends up going to a, quote, liberal seminary.
Right.
So my criticism of him saying that he was an evangelical was really unfair, because evangelical seminaries wouldn't accept him. In those days, they just didn't.
Okay.
And so then, of course, I quickly dropped the idea that wherever there's evangelicalism, there is God, because I began to realize that God was a lot bigger than that. And so I started reading the Bible for myself. I came to a real crisis of faith, and I just didn't quite know what to do with it all. And then I was on campus. I was in college at the time of the Cultural Revolution, when everybody went from being Negro to being black, and there was militancy and all the rest of that. And my nice little neat questions that I had, the answers that I had to the questions that I thought were out there, were no longer relevant, and I just didn't know quite what to do. So I started reading my Bible. I just plunged into the Bible, and I began to see that God was a whole lot bigger than evangelicalism.
Okay.
And that orthodoxy can be measured in more ways than in terms of how you set your theological syllogism, your doctrinal syllogisms, A, B, C, 1, 2, 3. Now, when we think of theology, theology is one coin with two sides. There is the epistemological side of theology, which basically concerns itself with what we should know about God. And then there's the ethical side, how we should obey God.
Right.
And you don't have theology without having both of those. So if you only have one, you have an illegitimate theology. Okay? If you have one of the epistemological thing, then you have scholasticism. If you have only the ethical thing, you have moralism. You can't, either one of those won't work. You got to have them together.
Okay.
Now, the evangelical church, or shall I say the Western church in general, Western theology has tended to be more oriented towards the epistemological side than the ethical, much more so. That helps me to understand why some of the great evangelical leaders of the past, like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield and others, though they were powerful preachers, condoned slavery.
Right.
How in the world can you believe in all of this and then condone slavery? Something's wrong. And so their theology was defective at its very core, not in terms of what it said, but in terms of what it didn't say, because they were not on the ethical side.
Right.
Now, when I look at my Bible and I see judgment scenes in the Scripture, the issues always seem to be ethical more than epistemological. So the ethical side must be very important to God. I'm not saying it's exclusive. We need both.
Right.
So when I see Dr. King coming up, I'm looking at historic African American theology, which has tended to be more ethical than epistemological. You know, I'm going to stay on the battlefield till I die.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to treat everybody right. You know, those kind of things. That's ethical stuff.
Right.
Whereas the hymns and stuff that come out of the white experience tend to be more in the area of, you know, doctrine, you know, that kind of thing. I'm going to subscribe to the Confession of Faith or whatever. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And I'm not knocking either one. I'm just saying that's where the emphasis is. So historic black African American theology, I'm not talking about modern black theology, I'm talking about historic. As we interacted with Scripture, we had the tendency to be more on the ethical side, because after all, we were in the context of ethical wrongs being done to us. That's how we saw sin,
Right.
a whole lot, you know, in the social sense. And so what Dr. King was more a product of, he had an orthodoxy of social ethics. There it is. He was orthodox in terms of social ethics. He may not have been quite as orthodox in terms of epistemological stuff. But then you look at these guys like Whitefield and Edwards, and they might have been orthodox in terms of epistemology, but they were in heresy in terms of ethics.
Okay.
You see? Mm-hmm. So it depends on what you mean by orthodoxy. You got to look at both.
Okay.
And if you look at both, and if you look at all of us have errors in our theology one way or the other. You know, there is no theology, there's no theological system that can account for everything that the Bible teaches, except for one. The only theological system that accounts for everything the Bible teaches is the Bible itself. Everything else, you know, all of our theologies fall short one way or the other. So we can appreciate our theologies for what they are, for what they give us, and then, you know, we have to recognize their limitations. So King came up, that was his orthodoxy. He may not have been an evangelical, but he certainly was miles ahead of a whole lot of evangelicals in terms of the social ethics piece. Okay. So that's kind of how I thank God for him. I believe that he was a prophet, and certainly he had his quirks, and certainly he had his sins and all the rest of that. But so do I, and so do you, so does everybody. I'm certainly glad that we can't read each other's minds, because we'd find a whole lot of mess going on. We'd be at each other's throats, you know. So anyway, that's kind of my perspective on Dr. King. One other thing I will say, one of the great legacies he left us was this, that over the years we had this ethical theology. It was a theology of suffering,
right?
You know. And we used that theology over the years as a coping mechanism, you know, to cope with the discrimination we experienced, the hardships. You know, it helped keep us going from week to week. And we have been using it for that. But Dr. King, in 1955, on December the 5th to be exact, he gets up and makes the speech after the first day of the Montgomery bus boycott. And in that speech, he basically said that this theology of suffering that has been a coping mechanism for all these years will now be a weapon against injustice. We had never thought of that as a weapon. But he harnessed it, he weaponized our theology of suffering, and that was the birth of the civil rights movement. That night, the civil rights struggle became the civil rights movement. The difference between the struggle and the movement was, the struggle was we were fighting segregation and discrimination and racism, but we had no hope of winning the battle. But we fought it in spite of that. The civil rights movement showed us that we could win. And it electrified people all across the country. So I think that's the legacy that Dr. King leads us. And very few, if any, have seen that, because they have not had the theological tools to understand that. The civil rights movement at its very core was theological, and a lot of people didn't recognize that. So that's what King has got to leave. That's his legacy for us.